The holographic display flickered to life, casting a sickly blue glow over the war room. General Adrian Vance sat motionless at the head of the long, reinforced steel table, his fingers curling into fists against the cool surface. Around him, the assembled military leaders and top-ranking officials of Earth's Lunar Command watched in grim silence. The transmission was being streamed across the entire Terra network, every human world, every station, every fleet. A figure materialized on the screen, its elongated form draped in regal dark blue robes. Supreme Arbiter Raltorok of the Galactic Council loomed above a vast execution platform, his ridged face impassive, eyes like molten gold scanning the crowd. Behind him, the gallows stood in neat rows, a grotesque mockery of order. The prisoners, human men, women, and even children, stood in silent terror, their hands bound, nooses coiled tightly around their throats. Adrian could hear the rapid breathing of Colonel Damian Garfield beside him, the soft exhale of Major Carl Hudson further down the table. No one spoke. Raltorok's voice reverberated through the chamber, a deep and guttural cadence that twisted the universal standard language into something cruel. The punishment for humanity's defiance is death. These criminals, captured during their unlawful resistance against rightful council rule, will serve as a lesson to those who continue to oppose us. A hush fell over the room. Then, with a simple flick of the Arbiter's clawed hand, the platforms beneath the prisoners gave way. A cacophony of choked gasps, muffled cries, and spasms of struggling bodies filled the feed. The camera panned over the hanging forms, their limbs jerking before falling still, the last twitches of life fading from their bodies. The silence that followed was deafening. A sharp sound broke through, metal screeching against metal, as Vance's chair slid backward. He rose slowly, shoulders squared, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "Cut the feed," he said, voice low and measured. No one moved. The horror was still sinking in. "I said cut the damn feed." A technician scrambled to obey, fingers flying across the control panel. The screen went dark. The war room remained frozen. President Magnus Ellison, seated at the opposite end of the table, exhaled shakily. The leader of the United Human Systems was a man accustomed to the weight of impossible decisions, but tonight his usually steady hands trembled. "My God," he muttered, rubbing his forehead. 60,000 slaughtered. And they made sure we all saw it. Vance placed both hands on the table, leaning forward. "That wasn't a warning," he said, his voice as sharp as steel. "That was a declaration of extermination." "They were prisoners of war," Carl Hudson added, shaking his head in disbelief. "Under the Galactic Charter, they should have been granted rights, fair trials. This is genocide." "The Council was never going to follow their own laws," Colonel Garfield said, his deep voice carrying the weight of barely restrained fury. "We were fools to expect otherwise." Ellison straightened, clearing his throat. "Our response must be measured." A bitter laugh escaped Vance before he could stop it. "Measured?" He turned to face the president fully. "They just slaughtered 60,000 of our people on a live broadcast, and you're talking about restraint?" Ellison met his gaze, and though his expression remained neutral, his eyes flickered with exhaustion. "If we retaliate recklessly, we give them the justification they need to wage full-scale war against us." "They don't need justification," Garfield cut in. "They already decided we're beneath them. They're exterminating us because they think they can get away with it." The tension in the room coiled tighter. Vance glanced around at the faces of the men seated before him. He saw what he needed to see: anger, resolve, a hunger for justice. He straightened. "We can't sit back and let this happen. If we don't act, they'll keep killing us until there's nothing left of humanity." Ellison pinched the bridge of his nose. "And what do you propose, General?" Vance's jaw tensed. He knew the consequences of what he was about to suggest. Knew it could lead to a war unlike any the galaxy had ever seen. But the alternative, allowing the massacre to stand unchallenged, was unacceptable. "We strike back," he said. "Not with words. Not with diplomacy. With force." Ellison's eyes darkened. "A full-scale assault on the Galactic Council? You know what that would mean." Vance nodded. It means war. But we don't have a choice. A silence stretched between them. Ellison leaned back in his chair, his gaze unfocused as he weighed the impossible. You'll need a plan. I already have one. Ellison exhaled sharply. Of course you do. He turned to the rest of the room. Does anyone here have an alternative? No one spoke. The president sighed, rubbing his temples. Then we proceed. But this war, he looked back at Vance, his expression unreadable. It will be yours to command. Vance inclined his head. I wouldn't have it any other way. The meeting adjourned in somber silence. As the officers filed out of the war room, Vance remained behind, staring at the darkened screen. The image of those lifeless bodies still burned in his mind. 60,000 lives. 60,000 reasons to fight. And by the time this war was over, the Galactic Council would learn the full meaning of vengeance. The war room was silent save for the rhythmic ticking of the orbital clock mounted above the command console. General Adrian Vance stood before a massive tactical display, his hands clasped behind his back. The Galactic Council had made their move, and now it was humanity's turn. A single transmission had wiped away decades of fragile diplomacy. There would be no peace. There would be no negotiations. The only thing left was war. The door hissed open, and Colonel Damian Garfield entered, his presence as heavy as the reinforced boots that carried him forward. He was a man shaped by war, his broad frame adorned with the scars of countless battles. His gaze met Vance's, and in that unspoken moment, an understanding passed between them. This was no longer about strategy. It was about vengeance. They're waiting, Garfield said. Vance inhaled deeply before turning away from the display. The War Council was assembled in the adjacent chamber. The most hardened and brilliant minds of Earth's military forces gathered in one place. As they entered, Vance's gaze swept across the table. Major Carl Hudson, Earth's foremost strategist, adjusted the cuff of his uniform, his sharp blue eyes betraying no emotion. Admiral Lance Drayton, the architect of the Terran fleet's most decisive victories, leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping against the metal surface. Commander Finn McAllister, the unpredictable yet irreplaceable ace pilot, exuded his usual air of barely contained restlessness. Each of these men had faced the void of war and returned stronger. Now, they were here to ensure humanity did not fall. Vance took his seat at the head of the table, his fingers drumming lightly against the console as he activated the holographic map. It flared to life, displaying the vast expanse of the Council's controlled territory. Red markers indicated enemy fleets, supply lines, and strategic outposts. The weight of what they were about to do settled over the room like an invisible force. We don't have the numbers to take the fight directly to them, Hudson began, his voice measured. The Council commands over 2,000 warships spread across 3 sectors. If we meet them in open battle, we'll be outgunned 10-1. Then we don't fight them in open battle, Vance said. We strike where it hurts. Their infrastructure, their supply chains, their key personnel. We make them feel the cost of every life they took from us. Garfield nodded. Guerrilla warfare. Targeted strikes. The kind of war they're not prepared to fight. Admiral Drayton folded his arms. That means we'll need intelligence. Movement patterns, weaknesses in their patrols, locations of key military assets. We have a lead, Hudson said, tapping a command into the console. A new marker appeared on the display. This is Outpost Kvara, a mid-tier intelligence hub for the Council. It's lightly defended, but the data stored there could give us the locations of their key command centers and fleet deployments. Finn smirked. Let me guess. We break in, steal their secrets, and leave a pile of wreckage behind. Vance's lips curled slightly. Something like that. A murmur of approval spread through the room. It was a risk, but it was their best shot. A swift, precise strike would give them the information they needed to turn the tide. Drayton leaned forward. We'll need a fleet on standby in case things go south. Vance nodded. Have the Indomitable, Sabre, and Ironclad stationed at the nearest relay point. We go in fast, hit hard, and extract before the Council can respond. Garfield cracked his knuckles. I'll lead the ground team. Hudson turned to Vance. And if this fails? Vance met his gaze without hesitation. Then we adapt. But failure isn't an option. No more words were needed. The council disbanded, each man moving with the precision of warriors who had long accepted their roles in the coming storm. Hours later, the Black Reaper, a modified stealth frigate, slipped through the void like a phantom. Inside, Garfield and his strike team checked their weapons, their movements methodical and practiced. The tension in the air was palpable, but no one voiced their fears. Fear had no place here. Vance stood near the drop bay, his gaze fixed on the approaching outpost. The facility loomed ahead, its metallic surface reflecting the distant glow of a dying star. The council had no idea what was coming. The ship's comm crackled. "Reaper, this is command. You are clear for insertion." Garfield motioned to his men. "Let's move." The bay doors slid open, and one by one, the strike team vanished into the darkness. Inside the facility, the alien sentries patrolled in calculated intervals, their elongated forms moving with the rigid discipline of beings who had never known true war. They were unprepared for the shadows that came for them. The first guard dropped without a sound, a blade slipping between his chitinous plates before his body was dragged into the darkness. The next fell in a silent burst of suppressed gunfire. The team advanced through the corridors with lethal efficiency, navigating the facility with practiced ease. Garfield led them to the data core, where a single technician recoiled in horror as they breached the chamber. "Don't," Garfield warned, leveling his rifle at the trembling alien. The technician hesitated before slowly raising its hands. Garfield nodded to Hudson, who moved to the console and began extracting the data. Outside, alarms began to blare. "Damn it," Finn's voice came through the comm, "they've got incoming ships." Vance's pulse remained steady. "How many?" "More than we'd like." Hudson's hands flew across the interface. "Almost there." The facility shook as enemy forces converged. The team dug in, exchanging fire with the advancing sentries. Garfield took down 3 in rapid succession, his movements precise and ruthless. "Data secure," Hudson shouted. "Then we're leaving," Garfield growled. The team fought their way back, every step a battle against the tightening noose of enemy forces. By the time they reached the extraction point, the docking bay was a war zone. The Black Reaper hovered above, its side cannons providing covering fire as the team scrambled aboard. The ship shot into the void just as enemy reinforcements arrived. "Tell me we got what we needed," Vance said as he strapped into a seat. Hudson grinned. "Oh, we got more than that." As the ship jumped to FTL, Vance allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. The battle had begun, and humanity had drawn first blood. The bridge of the Indomitable was a storm of activity. Holographic projections shimmered above the central command table, displaying real-time fleet movements as the Terran forces prepared for battle. The void beyond was a tapestry of distant stars, soon to be marred by the fire of war. General Adrian Vance stood at the helm, his sharp eyes locked onto the tactical readouts. Every moment that passed brought the Galactic Council's armada closer to Mars. This would be their first true test. Admiral Lance Drayton paced behind him, arms folded, his gaze flicking between the screens. "Their fleet is larger than we anticipated," he said. 2 dreadnoughts, a dozen cruisers, and at least 40 smaller escorts. "They brought a hammer," Vance muttered. "Let's see if we can turn it against them." The Battle of Mars had already begun in the outer reaches of the system. Human fighter squadrons clashed with Council interceptors, streaks of plasma crisscrossing the darkness. Mars orbital defense platforms, battered but operational, fired their rail cannons in rhythmic succession, tearing through the first wave of enemy ships. But it wasn't enough. The Council's main fleet advanced like a wall of death, shields absorbing the initial bombardments with frightening efficiency. "Commander McAllister, are your squadrons in position?" Vance's voice remained steady as he opened the comms. McAllister's voice crackled through. "Locked and loaded. Just give the word. Hold until they break formation. Then strike their rear line." Vance turned his attention to the planet below. Mars wasn't just a colony. It was Earth's last major stronghold before the homeworld itself. If it fell, humanity would lose more than a strategic position. It would lose hope. A deep hum resonated through the ship as the Indomitable's forward railguns charged. Across the fleet, captains issued final orders. The moment had come. Engage. The battlefield erupted. The Indomitable fired its main cannons, massive tungsten slugs ripping through the void at relativistic speeds. The leading enemy cruiser took a direct hit, its shields shattering before the projectile gutted its hull. Explosions burst like miniature supernovas as ships on both sides met their end. McAllister's squadrons surged forward, weaving through the chaos with deadly precision. They exploited the gaps in the Council's formation, tearing through enemy rear lines with blistering, strafing runs. In the command center, Vance monitored every movement, his mind racing through calculations. He saw patterns the enemy didn't, weaknesses they failed to account for. Redirect fire to Sector 6, he ordered. Force their flagship to maneuver left, toward our mines. The Council Admiral, unaware of the trap, took the bait. The Aegis, a monstrous dreadnought at the heart of their formation, veered slightly to avoid the concentrated bombardment. That was all it took. The moment its hull crossed into the designated coordinates, a sequence of concealed mines activated. The shock wave rippled outward, tearing the ship apart from within. A cheer rose from the human fleet, but there was no time for celebration. The second dreadnought retaliated, unleashing a barrage of energy lances that cut through 2 Terran battleships in a single sweep. Status of the ground defenses? Vance asked. Strained, but holding, Hudson responded. They've deployed ground troops near Olympus Mons. Our forces are engaged, but they need air support. Vance tapped his comm McAllister. I need fire support over Olympus Mons. Get it done. You got it, came the reply, followed by the roar of afterburners as McAllister's wings shifted course. On the Martian surface, the battle raged in dust and fire. Colonel Damian Garfield led the charge, his rifle spitting bursts of plasma as he carved a path through the enemy lines. The alien invaders fought with cold precision, their armored forms built for war, but Garfield and his men fought with something greater, righteous fury. Push forward. Garfield bellowed, hurling a grenade into an enemy barricade. The explosion sent bodies flying, the air thick with smoke and the scent of burning metal. Above them, human bombers streaked across the crimson sky, raining destruction on Council dropships. The tide was turning, but Garfield knew better than to assume victory too soon. A deep rumble trembled through the ground, and then he saw it, an enemy walker, a towering war machine bristling with weapons, its massive feet crushing debris as it advanced. Its cannons swiveled toward the human forces. McAllister, Garfield growled into his radio. I need that thing gone. On my way, came the reply. A moment later, a single missile streaked from the sky, striking the walker's weak point at the joint. The explosion sent it toppling, and the human forces surged forward, driving the enemy back. On the Indomitable, Vance received the update. The enemy was faltering. He could see it in their erratic movements, their increasingly desperate maneuvers. They're breaking, Hudson said. Then we press the advantage, Vance replied. Admiral Drayton, take the fleet forward. Let's finish this. The human fleet surged ahead. Council ships attempted to retreat, but the noose had already tightened around them. One by one, they fell until the last remaining cruiser, its engines crippled, broadcast a distress signal. Incoming transmission from the enemy flagship, the comm officer announced. Vance exhaled, stepping toward the console. Patch it through. The holographic feed crackled to life, revealing the alien admiral. His face, once confident, was now lined with barely concealed panic. General Vance, he said, voice strained. We wish to negotiate. Vance's gaze hardened. The image of the mass execution played in his mind. The thousands of human lives lost without mercy. There is no negotiation, he said coldly. The feed cut. A moment later, the last enemy ship was reduced to fire and wreckage. Silence settled over the battlefield. The war for Mars was over. Humanity had won. On the surface, as the last alien forces surrendered or were eliminated, Garfield stood amidst the ruins, his rifle slung over his shoulder. The dust was settling, but he knew this was only the beginning. Vance's voice came through his earpiece. Mission accomplished. Garfield exhaled. For now. Because they both knew the war wasn't over. The Galactic Council would retaliate. They would come back stronger, angrier, more desperate. But Vance didn't care. Because now, humanity had proven that they would not be hunted. They would not be broken. They would not kneel. And the next time the Council came, Earth would be ready. The void of space stretched endlessly beyond the viewport, vast and silent, a cosmic battlefield waiting for the final clash. General Adrian Vance stood in the command center of the Indomitable, staring at the tactical display. The Galactic Council's homeworld, Zanvra Prime, loomed ahead, a fortress of towering citadels and heavily fortified orbital defenses. This was it, the heart of the enemy, the place where the Supreme Arbiter Raltoric dictated the genocide of 60,000 humans without hesitation. And it would be here, in the throne of their power, that vengeance would be delivered. The fleet was in formation. Every ship, every soldier knew what was at stake. There was no retreat, no fallback plan. This was the last move in a war that had consumed entire systems, reduced planets to ash, and forced humanity into a battle for its very existence. Colonel Damian Garfield secured his gear, checking the charge on his plasma rifle one last time. He stood among his men, an elite strike team outfitted for the most dangerous mission of the war. Their objective was clear: break through the defenses, infiltrate the Council's palace, and execute Raltoric before the entire galaxy. Admiral Lance Drayton's voice came through the comms, steady as steel. Their fleet is mobilizing. We count over 300 ships in the system. Vance didn't flinch. Then we burned them to the ground. The battle erupted in a single moment, a synchronized fury of light and destruction. The Indomitable unleashed its full arsenal, sending volleys of high-velocity slugs tearing through enemy ranks. Human warships surged forward, flanking the Council's fleets with coordinated precision. Fighters screamed through the chaos, engaging in lethal duels that left burning wreckage drifting through the void. But the enemy was prepared. Their defenses were thick, their firepower overwhelming. Vance watched as 2 human frigates were torn apart in seconds, their hulls splitting open, their crews vanishing into the abyss. Every inch forward was paid for in blood and wreckage. Garfield and his team launched from a Black Reaper, their dropship slicing through enemy fire as it descended toward the capital below. The city of Zanvra Prime was a monstrous sprawl of alien architecture, its skyline dominated by the Council's central palace, a monolithic structure built from the bones of conquered civilizations. The streets swarmed with enemy soldiers, their forces rallying for a desperate last stand. The moment the team hit the ground, the fight turned brutal. Plasma bolts scorched through the air, cutting down soldiers on both sides. Garfield led the charge, his rifle barking fire as he tore through the enemy lines. His men followed without hesitation, moving with lethal efficiency, each kill bringing them one step closer to the palace gates. Inside the throne chamber, Raltoric stood before a grand display, his golden eyes narrowed as he observed the battle unraveling. He was ancient, his kind having ruled for centuries, believing themselves untouchable. Yet now, their empire was crumbling. The humans had done the impossible. A Council officer rushed forward, his voice laced with desperation. "Supreme Arbiter, we must evacuate." Raltoric silenced him with a single raised claw. "No, they will come. Let them. I will face them here." Above the capital, Vance watched as the palace shields flickered and collapsed under sustained bombardment. It was time. "Strike team, you're clear. Finish this." Garfield and his men breached the palace doors, moving like wraiths through the grand halls. Alien guards fell before they could react, their weapons clattering to the marble floors as human soldiers cut them down. The final corridor loomed ahead, massive doors leading to the Arbiter's chamber. The moment they stepped inside, the doors sealed behind them. Reltorek stood waiting, draped in ceremonial armor, a massive glaive resting in his clawed hands. His gaze swept over the intruders, filled with something that almost resembled amusement. So the humans send their best assassins, he mused. Tell me, did your people ever consider surrender? Garfield lifted his rifle, aiming directly at the Arbiter's chest. Did yours? Reltorek moved before the shot could land. He was fast, inhumanly so. The glaive swept in a deadly arc, cutting down two soldiers before they could react. Garfield barely managed to duck, rolling aside as the massive weapon embedded itself in the wall beside him. The fight became a whirlwind of chaos. The elite strike team, the best humanity had, was being cut down one by one. Reltorek fought like a monster, his movements precise, his strikes lethal. He was old, but he was not weak. He had ruled through fear and blood, and he would not die so easily. Garfield dodged another strike, pulling a combat knife from his belt and slashing upward. The blade caught Reltorek across the chest, drawing thick, dark blood. The Arbiter snarled, gripping Garfield by the throat and lifting him from the ground with terrifying strength. Before he could strike the final blow, a single gunshot echoed through the chamber. Reltorek's grip faltered. His golden eyes widened as he staggered backward. A fresh wound smoked in the center of his skull. General Vance lowered his sidearm, stepping forward through the carnage. He had arrived unseen, slipping through the chaos as his soldiers had carved a path. Now he stood over the dying Arbiter, watching as the once mighty ruler fell to his knees. The transmission was already broadcasting. Across the galaxy, every remaining council-controlled world watched as their leader collapsed, his body crumpling before the human general who had defied them. Vance stood over the fallen Arbiter, his voice cold, final. This is justice. He raised his weapon once more. The final shot rang out. The war was over. The aftermath was swift. Without their leader, the Council's remaining forces fractured. Some fled, some surrendered. Others, those too consumed by pride, fought until the last, their ships turning to debris in the cold void. On Earth, on Mars, on every human world that had suffered beneath the Council's rule, celebrations erupted. Humanity had done more than survive. They had conquered. They had proven that they were not prey, that they were not weak, that they would never again bow to the whims of alien tyrants. In the days that followed, Vance stood before the remnants of the Council's governing body, now little more than broken bureaucrats seeking mercy. He granted none. The age of their rule had ended. The galaxy belonged to those strong enough to claim it. As the sun rose over the shattered remains of Xanvar Prime, Garfield turned to Vance. So what now? Vance exhaled, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Now, he said, we rebuild. Because humanity was no longer fighting for survival. Now, they were fighting for dominance.